Hi, everybody. Welcome to Radical Civility. My name is Ben Piccini. I want to take you to the end of the podcast. Before and after the podcast, there's always like a little discussion session. And me and my friends were talking about how did that go? And how would you critique what we just did? Like, let's be our own worst critics for a second so we can do better. And Alejandro, who you're going to meet in a second, he's just a really thoughtful guy, says, the critique I would level is that we could have done a better job listening to the other side. Here, I'll play it for you so you can hear it. What did you all think?
I thought it was great. I thought, I'm pretty sure a lot of people won't be satisfied, but I mean, it's hard to satisfy those people. So
I mean, the other downside is I feel like we could have talked for 3 hours, and in my head I kept thinking, I cannot talk about tenure policy for 6 hours, right? Like I can't give my personal opinions on how BYU should run its research program for the next 3 hours, though I really, really wanted to.
The only thing I could seriously see them saying is that we didn't take enough time to understand the people who are hurt. And it's hard because we don't have a panelist who is in that camp. I don't think.
So Alejandro says that, and I'm blown away because he's right. And podcasting kind of puts you in the cycle where you think other people should listen to you, right? And then Alejandro does one better, and he goes and has another podcast. He does his own podcast and involves a couple of people. And what he does is he says, okay, why did this hurt if you're LGBTQ in the and a member of the BYU community? And he spends his entire hour just listening. That's a pretty awesome thing to do. I'm not always as good at listening as Alejandro is, and I think that's I appreciate being around friends that make me better. So the first thing I want to say is there are two crowds I could play to in this podcast. One is all the people who already agree with me, and I could rah, 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 and that's fine. I don't think that's particularly helpful. But that means that I'm playing to a crowd instead who may disagree with me. And that's a little scarier because there's not a lot of intellectual grace these days. A friend of mine says that you have to put the but of course statements when you write. Well, but of course I didn't mean that, right? But you still have to say it. You have to be really precise so people don't misunderstand you. And I agree, and that's why we have good editors, and we need to do that. But I'm also concerned that as intellectual generosity fades, our essays are going to be nothing but of course statements. I find myself having to caveat more and more and more, both in speaking or in writing, and you'll see that a little bit. I went back through and listened, and I thought, man, I talk too much. And a lot of what I'm saying is, well, but also think about this other side, and I didn't mean it quite like that, and I hope you understand where I'm coming from, and that it's just fluff, right? It doesn't add anything. It's just a marker of the fact that I'm worried that I'll be misunderstood, and that's hard. So if you're here, I'll make you a deal. If you listen and extend some generosity to us, I promise to listen and extend some generosity to you. Doesn't mean we'll agree. Listening does not mean agree. I think that's really important. And if I'm cynical, at the end of the podcast, I say, there's always more you can listen to. There's always more listening that can be done fruitfully. And at the same time, there are always people who will say, well, you haven't listened enough because you don't agree with me yet. And if you were agreeing with me, then I would know that you'd listened enough. And it's just a rhetorical trick. I'm going to choose to not be cynical, to be genuine instead, and to say, I've got a lot more listening to do on this, and I'm okay with that. That doesn't scare me or threaten me in any way, and I mean it. So, what are you going to listen to? This is sensitive enough that I want you to know going in what you're in for. And effectively what you were in for is there's kind of become two camps. There's the follow the prophet camp, and there's the love and tolerance camp. And I think I tend to be more in the follow the prophet camp, and I want you to know that up front. But I think my point of this whole talk, this whole discussion, is that actually I think that those two camps, that there's a small but increasingly loud number of people who say, actually, I think those two camps can be in the middle. Those two camps can be both. Centrism can be a trap. It can be fake. It can just be fluffy niceness and moderation. I really think that actually what Elder Holland was asking us to do is to be both loving and kind and empathetic, and also to stand for church doctrine. And so if you're wondering what we're going to say, I think that's my summary or I shouldn't say that. That's my takeaway. My panelists may have very different takeaways. They represent themselves. Now seems like a good time to mention, by the way, in passing, that we only speak for ourselves. We don't speak for our employers or our institutions or anything else. This is us trying to think through hard stuff that's controversial. I don't think we always get it right. I know I don't. I went back and listened. I told you I talk too much. There was some fluffy stuff, and I also sometimes kind of think out loud, and that's never a good idea. Trying to examine both sides in free time or in real time makes it sound like I'm taking sides when really I'm just trying to analyze it from different angles. So I hope you'll listen. I hope that you'll understand where we're coming from. And, listening doesn't mean agreeing. I don't expect you to listen and agree, and I probably won't agree with others, but I can listen and be empathetic and extend that generosity. And by the way, when I talk about the follow the prophet camp and the love everyone camp, I'm not saying that one is more loyal and the other one isn't, or that one is loving and the other one isn't. I view these, and we talk about Jonathan Haidt's kind of moral frameworks. It's about which one you prioritize. And I think both are really good, and I actually think integrating the two is really the answer. But that can also, there's some stuff in there too that we can talk about. Friend of mine, as I was gearing up for this, a friend of mine, I should complete my sentences. A friend of mine mentioned, he said, it's so weird, Elder Holland's remarks. He had heard the commentary, and then he came back and he said, and he actually listened to the remarks, and he said, I don't know how people have so misunderstood what he was saying. And one of the casualties in a conversation like this is that you miss the original content. So the first thing I would say is, if you're here to listen, I would encourage you to go back and listen with some intellectual generosity to what Elder Holland was trying to say. Obviously, he should write clearly and precisely, and okay, I can agree with that. But I think the conversation is not actually what he was aiming for. And that was kind of that was my goal in this, was to try and take that on. Now, I have my own bias and my own lens, and that is I tend towards a little bit of centrism. But the other one is I'm a school administrator, so I thought he was talking about being better teachers. And by the way, I think there's evidence to support that, as I'll talk about. In fact, let me show you really quickly. Let's see if I can do this. I'll move that over to here, and I will turn on my share screen thing. So this is an article by Tad Walsh. He works for the Deseret News. It says the news people missed in Elder Holland's BYU talk. And so there's lots of controversy and everybody's talking about it. But if you actually read some of this stuff, he said BYU should become the acknowledged language capital of the world. He famously said he was hopeful and expectant that out of this university and the church's educational system, there will rise brilliant stars in drama, literature, music, sculpture, painting, science, and in all the scholarly graces. Down a little further, BYU must not be made over in the image of the world. He emphasized quality teaching must be a heavy and primary emphasis for faculty. Those are the things that I actually took away from this. I worked in middle schools, and that was my favorite, that was my thing. I love this stuff. What I took away from this was, it's time for BYU to be better teachers. I wanted to talk about tenure and whether it's good policy for like 3 hours. And my friends were so patient with me because I really went on some rants, and I'm really good at ranting. But that's the angle that I think you're going to see. And for some people, and I want to be really clear about this, you're just kind of checked out. You're done. You don't need this anymore. That's okay. You can skip this one. And some of you are probably going like, okay, why is he talking about BYU and like weird church stuff? This is a political podcast. Normally we talk about politics. I'm a BYU alum, and I felt lately to talk a little bit more about church stuff. So if that's not up your alley, that's okay. You're welcome to skip it. But because it's a source of tension, because religion and universities and all of these big institutions are all, at the core of some core tensions, I think this is a really valuable conversation to have. I'm going long, so I'm going to shut up and wrap up. I think, let me just end on this note. If you're here, it's because you have decided to listen, and I appreciate that. I listened on a podcast recently to an interesting finding, and I don't know how much research there is to support it or anything else. It makes sense intuitively. But they were just talking about how curiosity is an antidote to extremism. That when you want to know more about the other side, when you want to understand where they're coming from, when you want to, when you're genuinely interested in their take, of removing them from the pro or anti or the flat two-sided, my friend Jeff Benyon calls it the stock characters from a play, right? When you're actual people with nuance and depth and thought and capacity, all of a sudden it's a lot harder to otherize and to be extreme. I think that's really valuable. And so If you're here, I thank you for listening. This is sensitive stuff. It's hard. Um, I will try my best to listen for the next week and just shut up a little bit more. And I hope that you'll extend the same grace to us, and that you'll stay curious, and that from something that we say, there might be something that's of value. I have talked too much, so I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to shut up. Thank you for listening to me drone on. I think I actually drone on for another 2 or 3 minutes as soon as we start. But welcome to the podcast on Radical Civility's podcast on the unique and special role of BYU. Well, welcome everybody. I am thrilled to have all of you. I am excited about this. I'm going to start just by framing this a little bit for people who are listening or viewing for the first time. We're going to talk about Elder Holland's recent address at BYU. One of the things that I like to say is that this is the cold take. Everybody has a hot take. It's been 4 or 5 days. That's on purpose, right? It takes time to get people together, so that's part of it. But the other part of it is I want things to settle a little bit so we can be deliberate as we talk. I'm pretty unambiguously in favor of the church on most things. And if that's not where you are, this listening to somebody on the other side can feel like a fight. That is not the intent here, right? I hope Nick and Alejandro and Jeff and anybody else that might join us, I hope you all feel like you can say whatever you feel. And at the same time, I want to be, really clear up front. If you're in a place where this talk is getting to you, we're going to be as kind and thoughtful as we can. And it's okay if this just is not the right time to listen. This is a heavy topic, especially regarding LGBTQ students and inclusion and a lot of this stuff. At the same time, our goal, and we talked about this a little bit before we started on the podcast, is to add a little bit of light to the conversation. There's always, there are 2 analogies I like to use. One is, heat versus light. In physics, or I guess in chemistry, some reactions generate a lot more heat than light. They're inefficient, right? Our goal is to generate a lot more light than heat. The other example is in audio work, there's signal versus noise. And there are a lot of people producing some noise, and that's okay. Our goal is to produce something useful and to have a high insight to word ratio here. So with that, I would like to start, actually, if I can, by one of the things that I find in a controversy, one of the casualties, is the original comments. And so what I'd actually like to start with is get your take on, as fairly as you can, what do you think Elder Holland was trying to say, and what is being lost that he was trying to say? So I'm going to give you an example with what's called the intellectual Turing test. This is one of my favorites. Alan Turing was a computer scientist who invented this test to see if a computer was basically indistinguishable from a human. And that was, you put up a wall between them and you slip them questions. And if they can respond to questions and you can't tell whether they're a human or a computer, then you've passed the Turing test. And that's this big test in computer science. Really interesting idea. The intellectual Turing test is really useful because you say, okay, let's say that you're, I don't know, pro-choice or pro-life. Take the opposite side's view and see if you can pass it off as though you were one of their side. Are you so good at representing their view that other people feel like you can represent it accurately? So what I want to start with is, welcome, Daniel. Daniel's going to join us. That's awesome. Hey, Daniel, welcome. How are you doing?
Hey, how are you? I'm
good to
going to have to be audio only because I am out and about right now, but I'm able to at least join for a few minutes.
That's okay. We're happy to have you for as much time as you'd like to be here. So I was just telling the group here about the intellectual Turing test. And one of the things I'd like to start with is, I want to ask you, as fairly as you can, what do you think the message was that Elder Holland was trying to communicate? And the context of this is, I've heard from a number of people who either didn't read the talk and only read the commentary, or read the commentary first and kind of had it framed for them, and then went back and read the talk. I think both of those are, challenging, right? And that doesn't mean you're a bad person if you did, that's fine. But what do you think, trying to be as fair to Elder Holland as you can, what do you think he thought the purpose of the talk was? And we can start with anybody who wants to go first.
I can say something first. I think
jump in.
The purpose of his talk was to challenge BYU faculty and staff to really step up their game in defending the teachings of the church. Okay. I think that he expressed a lot of concern that faculty and staff had been weak on that. They had not really defended the church in a number of ways, most notably on the doctrine of the family. And so I think he's calling them to rise up and defend the church more fully and forcefully.
Excellent. Who else wants to take a stab at it?
I'll jump in and just say, yeah, I agree with Daniel. And at its base, this is kind of inside baseball for people not a part of these institutions, particularly BYU, especially BYU Provo, but I think the other church schools are implicated a bit as well. And I would say, to elaborate on what Daniel was saying, one of the words you hear a lot in his talk is confusion. And so back to your signal to noise thing, maybe another analogy is crosstalk, right? If you're getting messages from the Quorum of the 12 and the Board of Trustees that are saying this, and then you're in class with an ostensibly church-sponsored institution, and you're hearing these other messages that are not complementary, but are in fact dissonant or contradictory or seem like that, that creates confusion. Well, and there's two forms of confusion can happen. One is, oh, these brethren are out of touch and they got to get with the times. And if they do, and the people, on campus, say the professors or administration who are promulgating these ideas are basically implying or even sometimes outright saying, well, this is going to change. In fact, we can be agents of change. We can be, with enough activism and social justice, we can force or facilitate this change that needs to happen. And then, and so you can feel that way. Or if you're maybe on the more orthodox sympathy, you could go, oh my gosh, this is basically treason, or this is, treason is too strong a word, but this is disloyalty. This is institutional disloyalty. And that is, and so why is the church permitting it? Are the brethren out of touch? Do they not know what's going on? Or do they not care? Or, so that's confusion, right? You don't know. The absence of an explanation forces you to be confused and maybe try to create your own explanation.
Somebody told me, and I like this, and I want to get to Alejandro and Nick if they have anything too, but a friend of mine said, it's very clear what the generals are saying, but the captains don't seem to be on board. And that does cause confusion. And there is a lot of that. And I think I think Elder Holland made very clear, like, that it's time to fix that. I love that you talked about disloyalty. I'm a big fan of looking at everything through Jonathan Haidt's, 5 moral, principles lens. Now, I want to clarify. A friend of mine told me today why it's all wrong, and he's got some really good points about it. I think it's a useful lens, right? I don't think it's the only lens, right? For example, you're not born with 3 of the 5 moral lenses, right? They change over time. We can develop these, all of that stuff. One of the tension points I see here is loyalty. Another one of the tension points I see here is authority, right? And loyalty to that authority. Another one is compassion, right? And all of these are Jonathan Haidt's like big 5 moral, sticking points.
Well, you could even add integrity.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing, in theory, everybody has agreed to this code of conduct and the governing principles and the sponsoring institution. And yet it seems like, I just heard somebody the other day say, yeah, I don't really believe in BYU, but he got into law school, but he said, I don't really believe in the church or support the honor code or the other standards, but it's a top tier law firm and you can't beat the tuition, right? Again, I'm not doing a good job with your Turing test, but that doesn't smack of integrity to me.
Yep.
I think that's valid.
About that, I think that I recently read Hyatt's book in a book club discussion on a Facebook group that I'm part of. And one thing that stood out to me, I was helped moderate some of the discussions, so I wrote summaries of some of the chapters. And one of the things that really stood out to me is he talks about how there's a generational aspect to these senses or tastes of morality. And the current generation is very focused on the liberty and equality senses to almost the exclusion of notions of integrity, of notions of group identity, of notions of these notions that I think are very strong in the church don't resonate in the same way. And I think that's part of what we're seeing. There's a focus on expressive individualism that, the only thing that really matters is being true to yourself, and treating everyone equally and not discriminating. And that's kind of the end all be all. And so I think Elder Holland is speaking to the values that many people that are listening and reacting negatively to just don't appreciate or don't see the same way. And that's part of the disconnect.
There's a fabulous talk that I have to recommend to everybody, and I think it might still be behind a paywall, but a friend of mine, Jeff Thane, gave a presentation at FAIR on this idea of the water that we swim in, we cannot see, right? And one of them is expressive individualism. It's these worldviews. And if you believe that the height of human achievement is to be yourself, right? To be free, to be who you are, then it feels like incredibly awful for somebody to be limited in this way. Another friend of mine said, though,
it's not paywalled, by the way. It's
is it not?
Yeah,
marvelous.
They just threw it up a couple days ago.
I really think it's required reading. And to be clear, Jeff's presentation, Jeff Thane is saying, I'm just asking you to investigate the worldview that you already have. You probably have one and you don't even realize it. And most of the time it's expressive individualism. Now, having said that, a good friend of mine just kind of messaged me and said, I think most of the world is kind of this expressive individualist kind of worldview. We've always believed that sacrifice and giving of ourselves, and we're not full ascetics, but we're also not full hedonists in our faith, right? We don't believe that it's the gratification of the pleasures of the flesh that bring us eternal joy. We never have, right? There's always been some amount of self-sacrifice, and that the meaning in life comes from some of those things. Anyway, Alejandro, I wanted to get your take really quick, especially because you're a student at BYU. What have you been hearing?
Well, my initial impression of his speech was, and I've been thinking about it a lot for the past few days. And then the thing that impressed me was his use of narrative and nostalgia, and he evoked those feelings quite often in his speech. And so when I hear people evoke narrative and nostalgia, I think they're trying to express their values more than express a systematic, logical type of thing. Because your values, like you can't perfectly articulate your values. And so the values that I hear Elder Holland talking about are things like being able to be a robust, thoughtful academic in BYU and have a well-rounded education and a great education, but at the same time uphold the values of the church and of BYU as an institution. And my impression also was that because I'm on social media all the time and I hear the noise on Twitter, I hear people, especially undergrads, talking about how suspicious they are of faculty at BYU and how BYU faculty might be undermining students and undermining their faith. And it's a murmur, and some people have tried to sort of capitalize on that. Surveys have gone out, like change.org. Petitions have gone out to try to get students to mobilize, and they can't get the signatures. They can't get people to come forward with names of professors, not consistently anyway. And so I hear this rumbling about, distrust of faculty, and then I hear Elder Holland evoke these emotions about, they have he backed up President Worthland's Office of Belonging, and he talked about how, back in the day when you would go to BYU, you would read about these ideals about the city of God and Plato's Republic and all these things. And so I hear Elder Holland trying to comfort the student body and kind of soothe their doubts about BYU faculty. And then that's what I hear on Twitter. That's what I hear on Facebook. And then the day before the speech, Professor Ralph Hancock was on Quick Media on YouTube, and he began to talk about one of the downsides of the specialization in academia. As people specialize in their field, they tend to ask questions that are super relevant and super salient to their specific field, and then they forget to ask questions about bigger, grander things like values in general. And so he says, Ralph would argue that that part of the conversation has diminished and is missing at BYU and among the faculty. And so I hear Elder Holland trying to address those things, soothe the student body, remind the faculty that this isn't just any other academic space. This isn't a place where cool and cold objectivity reigns. It's also in my opinion, it's a true university, because the original universities had the monastery, and then they also had the academy together. And BYU is persisting in that tradition. And so I hear Elder Holland trying to buttress that and bolster that. And I think I personally love the talk, and I personally align with those values, but I can see why others might not. And so I think that's why this controversy is erupting.
That's absolutely fantastic. I love that you said that we communicate our values through narrative. I have so many thoughts on that, and I love what you. Anyway, I could just comment on all the things you said that were great. Nick, you're next. Go.
Yeah, I love what Alejandro said about at the very end. He was talking about reminding the faculty and things like that, and that's ultimately what I took out of the talk. When Elder Holland goes and gives a talk, oftentimes I'm looking for different things that he's saying that are new to me and things like that. And I think the whole purpose behind his talk here is there's really nothing new. He's reminding us of things that were said before. He's quoting, Dallin H. Oakes and things that he's said to the university before, because I think a lot of the time, as has been stated, there's all these different influences coming in, and we just need that reminder every once in a while. And so it's nothing revolutionary. I mean, I think a lot of the phrases and the verbiage that he uses comes across as a little bit radical, but he's quoting people to get the attention that the matter needs right now.
I think that's well said. I actually said to a friend of mine, I think that Elder Holland is getting some opprobrium, not because he moved to the right, but because he refused to move to the left. This has been pretty consistent. And I'd actually like to start there. And to be clear, that's if you're in a place where you're frustrated with church policy, that's not going to feel very good. And I recognize that, right? So I'm not trying to minimize that, but I do want to be right. That is not my goal at all. But I do just want to say, I think, Nick, you're right. There wasn't any new policy announced, right? The only thing that was said was, hey, this is something we've been beating the drum on. Now, I'd like to add some context, because I like Daniel's, overall take, but I'm going to actually suggest that I think that the defending church doctrine was only a small part of his overall message. And the way that I'd like to frame this is, I remember hearing Education for Eternity when I was at BYU in Wilford Griggs's class, actually. Wilf Griggs is somebody who was quoted. I loved his classes. I would have taken as many classes from that guy as I could have. He was just a fabulous teacher. We learned about the city of God. We learned about the holy city, and it's still something that is just a part of my soul. Now, Education for Eternity, I remember we kind of joked about, it was when then Elder Spencer W. Kimball came down and set BYU faculty straight. Right, he kind of took them by the lapels and shook them a little bit and said, "You all need to get on board." And it's a very direct talk.
This isn't the first time. This is
no, not at all. And it seems to happen every 10, 20 years, right? Somebody has to go down and set them straight. I think Bruce R. McConkie did it a couple of times, right? And it's just kind of how it goes. Every time that happens, people tend to be a little bit upset and angry and angsty, and everybody else gets on board, right? And so this is not a new thing. But it also suggests to me, so there's Education for Eternity, there's the Second Century Address, which he repeats multiple times throughout the talk. I'm also going to include in the show notes for this page, or for this episode, a talk by Elder Oakes, the original musket fire talk that he gives, the original talk by Elder Bednar, that was given just shortly thereafter, and a talk by Elder Holland at the Maxwell Institute. And the case I'd like to make here is, if you're frustrated by the LGBTQ stuff, I respect that. This is hard stuff. But I think the primary message that he was sent to deliver was that BYU needs to step up in some very specific ways. When Elder Oakes gave the original musket fire talk, he spent a lot of time talking about how research does not compensate for bad teaching. He said it over and over and over again. I think he even used the joke. It was actually pretty funny. He lightheartedly said, somebody at another university might say that no failure in research can compensate. No, I'm going to get this wrong. No failure in teaching can compensate for success. You know what I'm trying to say. Let me see if I can get this right. No success in research, in teaching, can compensate for failure in research. There we go. I finally got it, right? And then he flipped it and he said, but at BYU, we know that no success in research can compensate for failure in teaching. He said, and then he said, faith without works is dead, but works without faith is even deader, right? And his whole point behind this is we have to start thinking through the undergraduate experience. That's also something that Elder Holland talked about. Elder Bednar talked about 6 months after that. He gave a talk called Meekness. It was on meekness, and you can find this on BYU speeches. It was a very direct talk, and both Elder Oaks and Elder Bednar speak specifically, repeatedly, about the spiritual danger of worrying more about your PhD than worrying about the lives of your students. I remember Elder Oaks quotes, I believe it was John Tanner, who was the academic vice president, saying, if you are doing research for vainglory, you are going to be abandoned by the, it was a very direct, like, we cannot do that here. And I don't remember the exact words, but like I said, I'll post the quote. Now, Elder Bednar's talk on meekness struck me particularly because I've had a couple of experiences with this recently. I asked a buddy of mine who's attended both BYU Provo and now works with me at BYU Idaho and was at a couple of other universities earlier. I said, what's your difference? What's the take that you find different between Rexburg and Provo? They said, well, Rexburg, for the first week, everybody wants to get to know their roommates. In Provo, everybody wants to get their roommates' ACT scores. And I think there's some unfortunate truth to that, right? The way that I very not kindly said it was BYU has managed to pull off being elitist without being fully elite. And I heard that in Elder Bednar's commentary, right? We have to do better at this. Right before we sat down to podcast, I saw an article by Tad Walsh. He works for the Deseret News. And he said, just as a reminder, here are all the things that people aren't talking about from Elder Holland's message. I was like, darn it, we were going to podcast about that. But it was all of this stuff, right? Elder Holland is saying, we are now in the 2nd century. Are we achieving those goals? And yes, as part of that, we need to defend church doctrine, but I don't think that was his core message. I think it went a lot deeper than that. All right, I have ranted. I will turn it over to somebody else. I will shut up for a second. But
can I make a comment on that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I went to BYU Law School for law school, and my experience at the law school, I had an amazing experience there. What I found, though, was that there were definitely professors who wanted the university law school to be basically just like any other law school. They had maybe a prayer at the start of the first day of class at the beginning of the year, and then the instruction the rest of the year would have been no different from any other law school in the country. If you got an audio recording of the class lecture, you couldn't tell it apart. And there were other professors, and I'd say this is actually both on the more liberal or more progressive and more conservative professors. It wasn't an ideological thing, but it was that really took the time to integrate the gospel in small and large ways. One of my favorite examples was my first day of criminal law. The professor starts by talking about examples of murder in the Bible. David and murdering Uriah for looking at Bathsheba, and some other examples, and he used that to talk about murder. That was just a very simple example, but that professor throughout the years had other examples like that. And I think that was a really powerful way to integrate the gospel into the law school. And so I really admired and I'm grateful for those professors that took the effort to teach the law in the light of the gospel, not just teach law and happen to be at BYU.
Spot on. I think you nailed it, and I loved your example. I will just say, I think the framing, I've seen now a few people on the right say, yeah, Elder Holland went down and smacked the left. And I think that is a pretty gross misunderstanding of what happened.
He smacked everybody.
He did. He absolutely did. And I will be honest.
If you don't feel smacked, I'm going to come smack you.
Let me say it this way. I had left-leaning professors who changed my life, who brought me closer to my faith in Jesus Christ and to the doctrines of the gospel. It was never that issue. I also had professors who were on the right as well as on the left, who felt like it was their job to preach their personal opinion and pretend that it was actually doctrine, or that it was actually the mainstream of their field. And that is not the case. And that actually does really bother me, even to this day. And I have professors who are like that. The other thing that I would say is, I think that, this is tricky to talk about. I have very strong feelings about some public school stuff because I was a middle school teacher and then I was an administrator. I think tenure is just not super great. It breeds this sense of entitlement. And so you have this really weird thing where people are so excited to be at BYU because there aren't that many jobs out there. So it's their dream job. And then after 2 or 3 years, once they've achieved, or I guess after 6 years, they've got tenure and they're like, well, I'm a BYU professor now. And so I'm really important. A friend of somebody I know said, who was affiliated, who's related to a BYU professor. The center of culture in the church is not Salt Lake City, it's Provo. And I wish Salt Lake would listen a little bit more to Provo. That was that was a major step back. Like, you're off base, man. Like, you don't get this at all. Like, that is not the direction this flows. And in fact, the reason why general authorities have to come down every decade or two and set people straight is because you think that that's the way the water's flowing when it's not. Now, I don't have much of a problem saying I want to be loyal to the people who lead the university. That just makes sense to me. I also don't have a problem. I think there are going to be a lot of people who are professors at other schools that make it to the Celestial Kingdom. If BYU is not for you, that's okay. They're going to be people with long hair and beards. That's okay.
It's not the only true and living university.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. Nailed it.
People who know me know I love words and I look at etymologies, and I'm probably a little take poetic license with some of them, but I think one of the worldly values that's infected some parts of BYU that Elder Holland was, that is creating some of the problems Elder Holland is trying to address is what you could call credentialism. It is the piece of paper rather than what that piece of paper represents. And so the words I think about are things like, well, you'll hear sometimes people say, well, that's a very prestigious university. If I were Elder Holland or anybody on the board of trustees, the last thing I would want was to have a prestigious university, because prestige comes from French word, the prestidigitation or legerdemain. This is don't look at this hand while this hand is making you think. That's not what we want to do, right? We want to have truth. We want to have light. The glory of God is intelligence was over the Fielding Center when I was down there, right? We want that. We don't want any of this prestige, this don't look here and look here. Same thing with sophisticated. Oh, that's a sophisticated university. That's a sophisticated critique. Of course, that comes from sophistry, or the sophists who used their intellect to, depending on how charitable you want to be, persuade or deceive. And so I wouldn't want, and I could get nostalgic too about my time, because I had some professors at BYU. I was at BYU Provo, and I got some great advice before I registered, which was take the professor, not the course. And, you can do that for a while with your generals and some other things. It's not quite so easy when you get in your major, but I did that my first year and I loved that. And I just had so many rich things. And the best thing my professors did for me was believe in me and challenge me, right? And this is, I think, a similar balance to the love and law that Elder Holland was saying too, with endorsing sin, but it's a similar thing here, because I think some professors may think they just have to cheerlead their students. And maybe some leaders, some professors, I think this is less common now, but it was pretty common when I was there, are kind of the sink or swim methodology, right? If I put enough work on you and make you work, if you get it through their survival of the fittest, then you're going to be a better student. And I do you a favor by not doing you any favors. But I needed my professors to challenge me, but I also needed my professors to encourage me. And when they found good things or good thoughts or whatever, they would say, okay, let's deepen that. Or Professor England was one of my, Eugene England was one of my professors. And he was tough. He really was, he'd write in that red pencil when he'd send my papers back on early Mormon literature or whatever. He'd say, yeah, you didn't get this right. You need to think harder about this. Or I also had Doc Smith, the legendary science fiction thing. I wrote some short stories for him. And same thing, he he would give it to me straight. And I think, this goes to Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's The Coddling of the American Mind, where I don't know what the temperature of BYU is right now on this matter, but I just know generally in higher education, there's a hesitancy to push back on the students to say, look, you're full of it. I mean, you wouldn't say it quite that way, but look, you're not really thinking very clearly.
I don't know. Sometimes I would.
Yeah, maybe you should, but this is not good reasoning, right? Start over. This paper from here to here is inadequate, and you can do better, right? You're better than this. You're smarter than this. You can do better work than this. Go back and think this through. And I think generally, at least in higher education, we're not doing that enough.
Well, and I want to hear from the other two, but I cannot let that slide without throwing in my favorite punching bag, which is if you imagine high warmth and high expectations on an XY axis, you've got authoritative teaching, you've got authoritarian teaching. That's high expectations, but no love and no warmth. You've got authoritative teaching, which is high in both. Then you've got neglectful teaching, which is low in both. And then you've got, enabling teaching, which is where you have high support and no expectations.
I've seen this in the context of parenting, I guess.
Yes, exactly. So we used to call it the warm demander. It's still commonly known that way. But what's interesting is that the research consistently says, both for teachers and parents, the best form to be is high expectations and also high warmth, right? And I think that that's true for teachers. I think what's interesting in this case, two things. First, I think a lot of people, as you said, have either shifted to sink or swim on the one side, or to the just be nice and kind and loving and let them do whatever. Elder Christofferson gave a talk, and his opening line was, "We believe in a God of high expectations." And if there was a message I could say over and over again right now, I think that is one. We know that Jesus is the Lamb; he is also the Lion, right? And I think both parts are integral to his identity and integral to us. Now, last thing I'll say on this is, I don't think that it's just the professors who need to do that to their students. I also think it's BYU administrators who need to have that high love, high expectations mix for their professors. Tenure gets in the way of that. Research instead of teaching focus gets in the way of that. And being able to have a hard conversation about, like, hey, we love you. We want to support you in any way we can. You're getting ratings back that say that you're just not a very good teacher. We have to address this. How are we going to help you? We're here to support you. We're not trying to push you out. But I honestly don't think those conversations are probably even allowed, right? They may not even be a part of what's going on right now. That's coming from a former administrator who loves those hard conversations, but I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. Nick or Alejandro, I keep going.
Yeah, I think it's what you're hitting on is actually a very crucial thing. There's a balance in everything, right? What you were saying reminds me of my experience on my mission. So I had the opportunity to be a leader in my mission, and I love my mission president. And essentially, each time we had a meeting together, he would start it out by saying, because we love the missionaries, we expect this, or we need this from them because we love them.
They're not contradictory. They're not contradictory.
Yeah, they're not contradictory. You don't have to choose love or expectations, right? You can have a high expectation, and I think you're going to even see that expectation is fulfilled a lot greater if there is that love to back it up. And so I think this is a crucial concept that not many people actually think.
When I was a middle school teacher, I would tell my students, "I love you enough to give you consequences."
Elder Holland, or not, Elder Maxwell used to quote George MacDonald, who said, I'm probably not getting it exactly, but he'd say, "God is easy to please, but impossible to satisfy." And my best professors were like that too.
I love that. That is, I'm going to use that in my class. Alejandro, go ahead.
So this is reminding me of just the discussion about Plato and sophistry and the academy and what's expected of us as people who are learning and in education. And I think about like the landscape we live in, like I live on social media, I was born with a username, and I think about Twitter and I think about Facebook. I was joking with you a few weeks ago. I say, every time I log into Twitter, it feels like I'm chaining myself into Plato's cave, and because it's so full of BS everywhere. Everywhere it's just BS
And
everywhere.
It's shadows.
Right, exactly. And there's a lot of self-deception happening. And we all live in this social media world. And so when we go to the academy, when we go to receive a higher education, a liberal education, or an education that frees you, you're supposed to be able to cultivate skills that allow you to overcome self-deception. And what we're seeing in the culture as a whole, I think primarily because of social media, is we are distracted by BS. And like the best professors that I had, because I first got my associates at UVU, and I took honors courses there, and I did kind of what you said was, take the professor, not the course. And so I looked up the best professors, and they all kind of took this approach of not just of objectivity, but of trying to cultivate wisdom and to gain insight and to overcome distraction and BS. And so so now that I'm at BYU, I am concerned for not only my fellow colleagues and students, but also for my professors. How much BS are we engaging in? Because I hear the bad arguments on Twitter and the bad discourse, and I'm thinking, are these students really? Do they exist at BYU? I haven't even told people yet that I'm accepted to BYU, because I'm scared they're going to come after me for criticizing them, and they'll report me to the honor code or something. Again, that's just me being paranoid, and that's bad thinking, but it's so easy to fall into that trap. And so, educators need to be held accountable. BYU, in particular, is trying to offer us a world-class education. It's trying to also bolster the values that it upholds, and at the same time, it's trying also to. I don't know if this is their goal explicitly, but I think it should be the goal that we should be cultivating tools and techniques to overcome self-deception, because we're in a world we've never had so much distraction ever before, and it's bad. The public discourse, there's already an anti-intellectual strain in our public discourse, and there's a lot of skepticism about our public institutions that then extends to the church and to BYU, and it's distraction, and we can't. The way that we frame issues is it's bad framing, and we have to cut through that. And I think I think that's why I like Elder Holland's use of story and narrative, and I'm kind of evoking to like that part of him that loves the humanities, because we're trying to cultivate wisdom and what it's trying to be. We're trying to figure out what it means to be a good person. What does it mean to be a good Latter-day Saint, an educated Latter-day Saint? And I think students and Elder Holland are looking for BYU to pump out examples for us to say, hey, this is how you can both be believing and intellectually rigorous and wise and a virtuous person. And I think that's the goal of BYU.
I had a choir teacher once. She was a public school teacher, and somebody asked, "Are we going to do any religious music in this class, or is religious music not allowed?" And she kind of laughed, and she said, "If we don't have any religious music allowed, that's not a lot of music that you can sing, right? Like, I mean, it's actually like most music, especially the older you get, the more music was religious." And I think the same is true of education. The more you go back in time, the more connected, the more education was revered as something holy, and that's not just in the Christian or Judeo-Christian setting. I think that's true kind of universally. I want to talk about something that you said, which is that social media is not real life. Now seems like a really good time to say two or three things. First, nobody that I know has perpetrated or supported any of the vile, nasty, hateful acts that I see being touted online. If I see anybody who does, I will have a very frank conversation with them. So I'm talking about, there was a video that was published about somebody using some slurs and some other stuff. And a number of people are saying, look, this is because of Elder Holland's remarks. Now, I want to be clear. If you're feeling frightened and scared because of all of this going on, those are legitimate emotions. I'm not trying to minimize them at all. But I do want to be clear about is one of the problems with social media is you see one example and it becomes, the pessimism bias just takes over and you assume that that's everything, right? I don't know of anyone who is going, yeah, that was great, keep it up, except for 5 trolls on Twitter, right? And those trolls are not worth my time. Second, every single person that I have talked to has said repeatedly, what they got from this message was love and kindness and tolerance without sacrificing church doctrine. And there's this narrative out, and I think honestly, this is part of why Elder Holland got some flack, because he called it out right on its face. He said, if you believe that love implies that you have to agree with me, then we're going to be at cross purposes. We're going to be really mad at each other. I don't believe that. Love does not mean that, I loved what he said. He said, I cannot think of even one time when Jesus withheld his love from anyone. And I also cannot think of even one time when Jesus said, well, because I love you, you don't have to live the commandments, right? He called out that belief that is out there right now. He kind of left people no wiggle room. And I think that that's absolutely right. I view myself as inclusive as I possibly can be, short of changing this doctrine. And I feel really good about that. If there's a student in my class, I want them to come to my office. I want to get to know them. If they're struggling with this, or if they're not sure about stuff, I want them to feel welcome. If a student makes a comment in class, I'm going to whip out my middle school assistant principal hat. We're going to have a really frank conversation about what's not okay in my class, right? I feel really good about that. And I feel like that's the right way to go. But there are some people who will say that I am hateful or bigoted simply because I believe in the church doctrines. And if that's where we are, that's going to be really hard. That's a toxic conversation. There's no good way to have that conversation. Last thing I'll say on this is, on the topic of social media is not real life. I have noticed that most of my friends who loved Elder Holland's talk are just being really quiet on social media, but they loved his talk. And that's because they don't want to get in fights. They don't want to be unkind. And they really believe that contention is not from the Savior, right? That doesn't mean that they're being cowardly. And it also doesn't mean that they necessarily agree. If you go out on Instagram or Facebook right now, you'll see a lot of people who are, making posts about how Elder Holland was wrong. And that's fine. That's their perspective. That's allowed. What I want to be clear about is a lot of people did support Elder Holland and still do, and they just don't want to get into fights about it. It's really hard to have these conversations well. I've noticed a number of people who have tried to have these conversations well. It hasn't worked out. It's become angry. It's become contentious. It's become whatever. And so what we're doing is we're just pulling back. Now, I don't think that's good. I don't think it's good for the most thoughtful people to pull back and say, I'm going to keep quiet. But I see that happening more and more. A friend of mine put it really well. She said, look, I'm not expecting everybody to agree with Elder Holland, but I can only count one or two takes on the other side that I would consider good faith, really thoughtful takes on intellectual Turing test kinds of passing kinds of takes that are taking into account what he was probably trying to communicate. And I think that's really, really important right now. And to be clear, when people are hurt, when you have an echo chamber on social media, that distorts stuff. So I'm not trying to blame anybody. But I think that's part of what's really important about taking the cold take instead of the hot take, taking a step back.
Can I pick up on something Alejandro was saying, Benjamin, that I think was really important? And if you indulge me, I was going to read a little bit from one of my favorite books, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. And you guys are laughing. That either means you know it or you like the title, but I think it's a wonderful book. And this is just from for opening chapter. And he says what he's trying to do in the book is like the old time lecture circuits. He says they were pushed aside by faster paced radio, movies, and TV. And it seems to me that the change was not entirely an improvement. And I would add, one of the things that music videos did is the cut. They used to have 8 seconds but before they'd cut. If you'd watch TV, old style TV, they'd have longer takes. But if you watch music videos, it's boom, it's 3 seconds, boom, 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 boom. So this is accelerated, what Pirsig is talking about here. Perhaps because of these changes, the stream of national consciousness moves faster now and is broader, but it seems to run less deep. The old channels cannot contain it, and in its search for new ones, there seems to be a growing havoc and destruction along its banks. In this talk, I would like not to cut any new channels, but simply dig deeper into the old ones that have become silted in with the debris of thoughts grown stale and platitudes too often repeated. What's new is an interesting and potentially broadening eternal question, but one which, if pursued exclusively, results only in an endless parade of trivia and fashion, the silt of tomorrow. I would like instead to be concerned with the question, what is best? A question which cuts deeply rather than broadly, a question whose answers tend to move downstream. And what I love about that, contrasted with what you're saying, Alejandro, is social media is even more than radio, TV, movies about the new, right? You see this post, scroll, right? They've wired into our dopamine receptors in our brain for novelty, and it's all about novelty. It's all about the new. And the university could be the perfect antidote. A good university could be the perfect antidote to redirect the question from what's new, what's the newest outrage, or what's the newest craze, either way, to what is best and what is deepest. And I wonder if some of the fragility we're seeing, one, it's because of COVID and we haven't gotten out much for 2 years, but also, and all our attachments are frayed, but it's also this constant newness has left our roots really shallow, and none of us are grounded. It's like we're all floating along this stream of consciousness. And so we can really easily get turned upside down or put into some other cul-de-sac in the river.
There was a great study. I was listening to this research. It was a Great Courses Plus course on how to raise students according to science, or how to raise children according to science, if you want to do what's best according to what the studies say. And one of the really interesting findings was that TV can actually be really good for kids. Sesame Street is great. Old Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was fantastic. But SpongeBob is not. And when you hear that, you get feelings because everybody loves SpongeBob and Squidward. And he actually explained that part of the reason why is because it changes scenes so quickly. And so it ties into ADHD. And he explained it better than I can. I don't want to try my hand at it. But I think that it gets to your point of this constantly changing scene, these flashing lights, these, distractions, all of this stuff. Over the long term, that is not healthy for us. And it's certainly not healthy for us as a society. I've likened it sometimes before to, I read a little bit about Stockdale once. If you've ever heard of Jim Stockdale, he was a prisoner of war. And he talked about the process by which they tried to get him to defect. They would tell him all of this stuff about American history, all the evil things that we had done. It was interesting because he talked about how Stockdale paradox, and I could talk about it for an hour, and so I'll try and limit myself. As I look at Twitter, I know that, 20, 30 years ago, if the Republican Party released a statement, the Democrats had an entire industry of people trying to make that statement look as bad as possible, and the reverse. I'm not blaming one side. That's just the nature of the dual party kind of thing. And now I think they've crowdsourced it. And that's what Twitter does. And Twitter takes any message, no matter what it is. And this is part of why I think we have to, again, I'm not blaming anybody, but starting with the source material and engaging with Elder Holland's text first before you hear the framing. I listened to the entire thing and I went, wow, that was amazing. That was really good. There was so much love. There was a call out to, let's be unified. Let's put away our weapons of war on this subject. Let's also defend church doctrine, which I think has been a needed thing to say. And 10 hours later, I'm looking at Twitter and I'm going, this is not at all what I heard. This is so different. Now, to be clear, people are still going to have opinions. I'm not saying that, but I've heard from 3 different friends who don't know each other and they have the same talking points, exactly the same talking points.
Where'd they come from? Yeah.
And it's social media, right? It's very obvious. And to be clear, I've done this before too. If I'm listening to church leaders and I just give those same bullets, right? But I think this is part of the problem, is that it's not just an echo chamber. This isn't just listening to people who think like us. It's an echo chamber with a vengeance. It's an echo chamber and a PR shop, right? An opposition research shop who's trying to tear apart the other side and make it as bad as humanly possible, so that we view it in the opposite way. And I don't think there's anything good or healthy about that. I think we have to be able to see.
It's completely ahistorical. So it is basically all about the present. So there's very little context to it. And that makes everything more fragile and more frazzled. Sorry, Alejandro, go ahead.
No problem. I mean, I think it's also worth attempting to engage in validation with the other side. So but here's the thing with validation is we confuse that idea today. We think that validation means something like, I agree with you wholeheartedly, but it doesn't mean that I can still validate someone and disagree with them. And it means something more like understand what they're feeling. And I think some people were hurt by the talk, and I don't think it's useful to ignore that. And I also don't think it's useful to say, no, Elder Holland gave a absolutely perfect speech, because there was an instance in that speech where he misrepresented a valedictorian in his speech about his coming out to BYU, students during his speech as a valedictorian. I think Elder Holland misrepresented that, and I think that was a mistake on his part. And I can understand why people will be very hurt to hear that, and then and they might question why Elder Holland would misrepresent something like that. If I guess I'll just add this in case people don't know, what Elder Holland said was that a student commandeered the stage and then gave a talk about his sexual orientation. But really what happened was that the student became valedictorian, submitted his speech, it was approved by the department, and then he gave it as planned. And I think I can see why that would be infuriating. And it seems like Elder Holland is speaking, from two, speaking on from one end of his mouth and then the other corner as well. So we have to, I think if we want to be honest and sincere, we have to own up to that okay, I can see that Elder Holland made a mistake. But I don't think we can, it's so hard not to be cutthroat with people who make mistakes, especially on social media, because everything is so curated and edited and clean. And this talk is obviously off the cuff and kind of improvised, which you don't hear at general conference. And so you're not used to hearing general authorities speak like that. And I hope that everyone who has a disagreement first tries to understand the other person and say, okay, well, why do you feel hurt? I am not going to pretend to say that everyone's reasons are 100% valid, but I think there's something there that we can address and say, okay, I understand, I can feel why you're upset, but we still love you, and let's talk about it, rather than throw each other under the bus.
Well, and I think I'm glad that you said that. And I want to be clear about just two quick things. If you're a student at BYU Idaho, I hope you feel totally welcome. And I especially hope you feel welcome in my class. And I hope that, somebody asked me about how do I let people know that they're welcome. And, in some ways I almost wanted to say, well, I'm a Christian. I hope that's all that I need to say, right? I feel like that's what it should be. Now, I will be the first one to say too, that not only are there some things that I might have done differently. I remember one of our recent podcasts, we talked about Elder Hollister. He had written a talk, and one of the things that I think is a valuable way to think through this is, are there some things that could have been done better? Always, right? And some of that is really valid. At the same time, there are some people who, no matter how much you had changed and tweaked the wording, or even some of the facts, it's the underlying message that is frustrating. I think there are some people at BYU who are frustrated that they got called out. Not over the LGBTQ stuff, over the fact that BYU needs to step up its game. I also think, to your point, when I heard him talk about the valedictorian, I was going, yeah, that was approved by a dean, right? The dean approved that, right? So if I give a talk that's approved by a dean, it feels really weird to get called out on that later. And I honestly thought, I wonder how Matty Easton is feeling. I mean, I only know him from Twitter. I don't even know if that's what he goes by, but I can imagine that being a really uncomfortable and weird thing. And I'm glad that people rallied around him and said, like, hey, that I hope that you are feeling supported and loved right now.
I have an interesting take on this, if you
please,
want.
Yeah.
I do think this could have been clearer, but whenever I hear something from a member of the Quorum of the 12 or the First Presidency, and this one actually is pretty easy to ignore if you're not at BYU right now, because it doesn't have to apply to you. So you can just dismiss it and say, oh, that's inside baseball. But nevertheless, whenever I hear something that sounds like it's wrong, the first thing I try to do is say, well, how might it be right? I do have questions about the same part of the talk. I do. I'm not clear on what he meant. But at the same time, I want to propose a different take on it, which is, I want to suggest Elder Holland wasn't attacking or criticizing Matty Easton at all. And I wonder, what if we thought, what was commandeered here? If you remember, there was a media circus that, in my opinion, turned both Matt and BYU into these caricatures, these stock characters. And all of a sudden it became, oh, here's somebody that's challenged this institution, this oppressive institution. And so all of a sudden you've got this stock play going on, this play going on that the media loves to do. And so what I think was commandeered, I can't say that this is Elder Holland, so I don't know, but this is the way I think what he's saying could be right, is the media feeding frenzy commandeered that pulpit, not Matt. And a wise dean might have said, you know what, this is too hot. The rest of your message, because you read his talk and there's nothing wrong with this talk. But maybe a wise dean might say, oh, with the kind of environment we're in, with the kind of school we're at, this is too risky to have you not get subsumed into this larger culture war and not have BYU get subsumed in the larger culture war. Maybe this particular venue is not maybe the best time for either you or the university. And it's possible that that's maybe what Elder Holland was critiquing and not necessarily Matt. Now, I might be up in the night and maybe I'm being too apologetic here, but that's a possibility that occurred to me as I use this heuristic to kind of approach Elder Holland's comments there.
I want to jump in on this. I think it is always the right instinct to be generous in the interpretation of others, so long as it's equal on all sides. And so, and I'll give a specific example of this. It's actually really easy for me to extend generosity to Elder Holland. I love him. I sustain him. He's like one of my heroes, right? I love the Elder Holland jokes. They're like the, what are they called? The Chuck Norris jokes, but only better, right? It's very easy for me to love and sustain Elder Holland and to see things in the best possible light from him. What's harder is to see a student at BYU saying a very homophobic slur to a group of students gathered around and try to give him the benefit of the doubt. My rule when I was an administrator was, you have to get to the point where you love the student before you get to discipline him. I wish that I could sit down with that student and extend them grace, not go easy on them. That's not what grace means. If you understand, at least not in my vocabulary, grace means you give them a chance to improve and that you don't call for their head on a platter. This kid needs a consequence. Don't get me wrong. I'm not exactly, I probably had too many suspensions when I was an administrator too. But I think that the starting point is, I want to understand where you were and why you did it. I want you to understand what effects it caused. I want you to process through this. And I want to believe that this is not just going to be a university action against you, but that rather this can be a learning experience where you can achieve some kind of redemption and change and become a better person. Giving Elder Holland the benefit of the doubt is really easy. Giving that kid that I don't know who's on Twitter, who's going viral right now, whose life is probably total hell, right? I can only imagine what it's like to see your face doing the dumbest thing you've ever done. And I don't know, maybe he's done this 1,000 times. I don't know who the kid is, right?
Yeah,
one of my favorite.
He seems pretty unhappy. Even
I don't think he's
in the
thrilled.
10 seconds. So
right.
Yeah, he's.
There's a great essay by Scott Alexander when he was over at Slate Star Codex, where he talks about the only thing I can't tolerate is, what is it? It's something like the only thing I can't tolerate is the out group. And he makes a really interesting point. Sometimes we claim that we're being merciful when we actually just don't have a problem with the underlying behavior. So if you don't think there's anything wrong with picking your nose and you tell somebody else, hey, no, it's no big deal. It's not because you're being merciful. It's because you don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? And in fact, I see this a lot. A lot of my left-leaning friends who are very in favor of restorative practices and, let's talk about it. Let's not jump right to off with their head. But somebody now just used a homophobic slur on BYU campus off with his head. I only insist that whatever bar you're going to hold Elder Holland to, and everybody needs accountability, right? Whether it's Elder Holland or this kid or whoever it is, that we extend the same amount of generosity, love, hope for grace, and that we're trying desperately to understand who they are first before we jump right to here's why they're wrong, here's why their head needs to be cut off, and then we move from there. Ale, I think I was cutting you off 2 or 3 times. Were you waiting to go?
No, I'm fine. I'm good.
We haven't heard from Nick, though. I don't know if you were trying to jump in.
Poor kid doesn't want to cut me off. You good?
It does remind me, though, I don't want to fall into the old trap. Robert Novak, an old conservative pundit, used to say, a liberal is someone who, when he sees somebody beat up and robbed by the side of the road, says, oh my gosh, we have to find out who did this. They need help. and abandon the poor person bleeding on the side, right? He says that's what a liberal in the political liberal, not a classic liberal, Anyway, but I watched that. First of all, my heart sank when I saw that, because this is exactly, what is going to create this cycle of recrimination, right? Where everybody's going to feel justified in their hurt, in their attack. And so my heart just sank. And of course, the media is going to have a field day with it, which is not amenable to restorative anything, right? But it reminds me of a time, my best friend, when I opened up to him about my same-sex attraction, he didn't handle it very well at all. And I was really shocked, because there were other people I'd disclosed to that had said homophobic things, and yet they were really great. And so here was somebody that had never said anything homophobic, and he had a real problem. And I got kind of angry, and I started throwing those words around, homophobia or whatever. But finally, a few days later, to his credit, he came and told me, well, he'd been sexually assaulted by one of his companions on his mission repeatedly, and it took quite a while for the mission leader to take action, the mission president. So here he was. I said, buddy, I've known a lot of us, and it's pretty rare behavior. So that is not a general thing, and I'm not going to do that to you, okay? But when people have certain traumas, or they have certain experiences, they can react in hurtful, terribly damaging ways. And again, and that's not, like you said, Benjamin, it's not to excuse it. That's not to say there shouldn't be consequences. But as part of those consequences, we ought to look at ways that maybe this can be remediated. And is there, if we could drill in, okay, where did this come from? Again, not to excuse it, not to let them off easy, but to say, all right, where did this come from? And what can we do so that you don't do this again? And maybe we could even turn you into the best advocate for tolerance and love and mercy. Wouldn't that be the best outcome? And I'm dreaming, I know, but
no, when I was an administrator, I remember I had a student. It was interesting. He used a slur on another student, and he was Hispanic, and the other student was Black, and he didn't understand why it was a problem. We had to have that conversation first, and he got in big trouble, and we did the whole thing. It was interesting. A couple of weeks later, he came back to me, and he got in trouble a second time for using the same slur. And I was furious. I said, we had this conversation. What are you doing? Right. And he just looked down at his feet, and he said, they were going to call me racist no matter what. Some things don't wash off.
Yeah. He had nothing to lose.
That's right. There was, and it was this idea of no grace that was so bad. Now, to be clear, he was also making bad decisions, and, that's on him. But I don't think the world has improved by a situation of no grace. Now, I want to be clear. If you're listening to this and you're on the opposite side from me, you're probably being irritated that I'm, giving generosity to Elder Holland, and now a kid who said something homophobic. My whole point in this is that if somebody was to do something on the opposite side from me, right? That we need to get to know them too, right? And I'm trying to even think of an example, but if a gay rights protester gets in a fist fight, and I'm trying to think of an example that's the same way. My first obligation as a Christian, and also as just a decent human being, is to understand what they were going through, who they are, what made them work this way. How can I make sure that I'm not just becoming another faceless person on social media condemning something because it's cheap virtue points, right? I think that's the key to this piece. All right, we should wrap up, but I want to get one quick lightning round from this, and that is, if you could say one thing that you're taking away from this talk that makes you better, or that you think people need to hear more of, or that you want to say, like, hey, that challenged me, and I'm going to have to wrestle with that a little bit. That's totally allowed too, because I think Alejandro's example was great, and that was actually the one that bothered me, and he said it before I did, so I didn't have to go there. But as kind of a closing thought, like, what's your one big takeaway, or the one thing that you would say to somebody who might be wrestling with this or something like that?
Wait, hold on. Let me see if I understand the question. You're asking what's our takeaway from the talk, or what's our takeaway, or like our 2 cents for someone who's struggling with this talk?
Either or both. And by the way, we can edit out all the wait time, so take as long as you
Sure.
need. But like, what's the one last thing that you want to say after this conversation? What's the one last thing that you would pitch in, whether it's to somebody struggling with it, or it's like, here's what I loved about it. Here's the part that made me really rejoice, or, here's the part that I really was challenged by. If you could add one more thing to this podcast really quick on this topic, what's the one thing that's burning a hole in your pocket?
I'll answer both of yours, Ben. Personally, where I was challenged was, again, this idea of demanding. I'm not an academic, but I think even in my discourse, I could be more rigorous. I could be less of the hot takes, like you say, less reactive, more grounded, both in eternal truth and in empirical support, right? Rather than tossing out assertions. We're really good at doing that is in this culture, just have opinions that are not formed by any sort of discipline and research, right? We think we Google it and we're instant experts in epidemiology or Afghanistan war policy, military logistics, right? But so that's what I took, where I felt a little chastened. I'm like, oh, you know what? I could step up my game here, even though I'm not an academic. And what I would say to people challenged by the talk is something a challenge back, and I don't mean it glibly, because I think it'll do our souls good to take up the challenge, which is, if you feel like there was a shortcoming, if you feel like there was something unclear, if you feel like there was something unhurtful or unloving, see if you can do better. In other words, we're going to improve the world not by lowering to the lowest common denominator, but kick up the game. So if you think Elder Holland was unloving, the best way to respond to that would be by being better loving, rather than being less loving or going into recriminations. And I'm not saying put up or shut up. I'm just saying that is how the world will get better. We can have this downward cycle, and we can go, oh yeah, well you did this. Oh yeah, well you did that. I see it with couples therapy in my office all the time, and it never ends well. But if each side is trying to model, and I hate to even think there's sides, but each participant in this, let's put it that way, each participant in this great big dialectic we're having in this social media, thing, if each person tries to model the best and how they want it, then even if the person you're in dialogue with doesn't get better, you will. And so it's going to be a win-win.
I love that. Alejandro or Nicholas, either of you want to go?
It's hard to come up with an answer, but the thing that's on my mind is primarily about values. I felt that the talk was about strengthening our values. And so for anyone on whichever side they're on, I think, we will all benefit of trying to figure out what we value and then aiming at that, at BYU, I think, the faculty is being called to help students have the most intellectually rigorous representation of our values, to be faithful and to be educated. And those who criticize BYU and criticize Elder Holland, I think they would benefit as well to say, okay, well, these are my values, and this is the most articulate, heartfelt, sincere way of presenting those values. Because I think if we focus on values, like, we're going to find a lot more confluence and agreement than disagreement. And I think these little zingers on Twitter and Facebook detract from all that. But I think we all love and truth and what's virtuous and safety and compassion. Those are the highest values that we hold in a culture, and I think we need to strengthen them, and we need to figure out how they can all coexist. And I think that's what Elder Holland is trying to do in his speech, and I think we all need to participate in that, and that will benefit ourselves and those who oppose us.
Brilliant. I love that. Nick?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when I think about civility. it oftentimes comes down to seeing people as people and not necessarily as their values. But I think a big important part of that in being able to see them as people is understanding their values and their positions and their interests and why they have those. And so I think one of the big things that I had a few questions about when I was reading this talk was, well, it's great that, we're supposed to love everyone, whether they live our lifestyle or not. But how am I supposed to do that? And I think it's oftentimes a lot easier than we realize, because I think it's a more common question, how do we actually accomplish both? That's a common question. And I think one of the key takeaways for me that Elder Holland gave me was, if I look at people and I try to discover, what's making them them, I'm going to have that love for them a whole lot easier than if I just look at what they're believing.
That's great. I'll close with just a few quick thoughts. This is the kind of topic that always scares me to talk about. And then I remember that the whole title of my show is Radical Civility, and the whole point is to talk about hard things well. I think we pulled it off in part. I think we did pretty good. I'm sure that I have biases, and I'm sure that if you come in frustrated, I probably am not leaving you completely satisfied, because I'm sure I don't see your perspective completely. But by golly, I'm trying my best to pass the intellectual Turing test. I'm trying to understand the other side. I'm trying to think through this stuff. I am legitimately excited to see what BYU is going to become. I think that there is a path forward for BYU that is exciting. It is unique. It is special. I believe it to be inspired. I sustain Elder Holland, and I also recognize that people are hurting right now, and that's okay. I believe that, to be honest, I think that he's a really kind and decent man. And one thought that I have as I've been thinking about this is, I guess if I were to leave with one thought, it's that because of our current sociopolitical weirdness that we're in, everybody, kind of latched on to the most controversial part of his talk. And I'm not saying that's bad. Like that, if that's your identity, for example, that's going to be like a big deal, and you're going to want to talk about that. That's fine. What I would say though is, I asked a friend, and he said, "Oh yeah, I listened to all the commentary, and then I went back and listened to the talk, and they were completely different." I said, "What'd you think of the talk?" He said, "It felt like the company CEO in an all-employee meeting saying, 'Look, guys, woke stuff is fine, but at the end of the day, we just got to sell some tchotchkes.'" And I'm still laughing about that, because I genuinely think that a lot of the message that Elder Holland was trying to get across was, we just need to do better. We have to do better. And I don't think it was limited or even primarily focused on defending the church, though I think that is one area that he had a concern. So I hope that we've done right by the title of this podcast. But if not, we tried. And I don't think that a podcast is going to solve all these problems. But I have learned a lot, including the etymology of sophistry. And now the movie The Prestige now makes sense in my head. I've never understood this before until this moment. So that's very exciting as well. Well, thank you to all of you for coming. That was a blast. And we'll talk to you next time.